We're in 2 Kings chapter 4, and we're beginning with verse 38. You remember Elijah got his ministry started when he said there wouldn't be any more rain. Of course, the result of that was famine. And now here we have Elisha, and two events are grouped here. They aren't necessarily related to the whole flow in time-wise, but they're by subject matter. And they are both relating to food during a famine period. So here we are at 2 Kings 4:38. When Elisha returned to Gilgal, there was a famine in the land. Now, a famine was mentioned later in 2 Kings 6:25. There was a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and the fourth of a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. That famine probably wasn't the one here. That was a famine in the town caused by the siege. They surrounded the city and wouldn't let them get any food in or go out to grow it. But in chapter 8 and verse 1, now Elisha spoke to the woman whose son he had restored to life, saying, "Arise and go with your household and sojourn wherever you can sojourn, for the Lord is called for a famine, and it will even come on the land for 7 years." And this could be the same one as we have in our text, or it could be a different one. The Hebrew has the article. In the Hebrew, it's the famine. And so that suggests that it was the well-known famine. This is the one that you know about. So that could suggest that it is the one mentioned in 2 Kings 8:1. Elisha directs food provision for the students. He's dealing with the sons of the prophets. So he's there at the seminary. That's what we'd call it today anyway. 2 Kings 4:38. As the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his servant, now we know that at one time his servant was Gehazi. Could have been Gehazi here. He's not named. "Put on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets." They were sitting before him. That was customary. They would sit at the feet of the teacher, in this case the prophet, as he was giving them instruction. And it speaks of the large pot. In some of the archaeological digs, they have found representations of a large pot, and the pot itself had 3 legs on it, so that the pot could be set over a fire. You didn't have to have something to swing it from. You just set it there on its legs and build a fire underneath, and it could hold stew or whatever. "Put on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets." Then one went out into the field to gather herbs. He went out to gather herbs. Doesn't say they all went out to gather herbs. Apparently this fellow was very industrious, but not very knowledgeable. Sometimes there are people that have more energy than smarts. And it might be wise to find out whether the gourd was poisonous or good for food before you put it in the pot. But then he wasn't the only one, was he? They were all there, I guess, and he sliced it into the pot. One went out into the field to gather herbs and found a wild vine and gathered from it his lap full of wild gourds. The word lap is used 214 times in the Old Testament, and of those 204 times it's translated garment, cloth, or clothing. Here, lap, because he was collecting the gourds into this garment. So how does that work? You get a hold of the hem of the garment, lift it up, and you've got a convenient carrying lap. That's what's the idea here. And he gathered from it his lap full of wild gourds. There are about 3 different suggestions from that time of gourds that grew in that area that might qualify as being this one. The one that I find most appealing is a cucumber-like plant with an irritant poison. But that doesn't mean I know anything about it. It's just, all we have to know is that it was poisonous. It wasn't good for them.
Poisonous is bad.
And the man gathering herbs did not know how to distinguish. When in doubt, don't. This is not about the mistake made by the young student. God was providing for them. He could have directed them to discover this before this, you think? Give his angel charge over them. If this young student didn't get it right when he came in, somebody could have said, hey, we ought to check that. Let's make sure there's something good to eat. But God did not direct that way. He had in mind something else that he was going to do on this occasion. They probably tasted the problem before they swallowed. Usually that sort of thing will taste bad. And you say, uh-oh, we ought not to eat this. There's a famine of knowledge of God. They had a famine of knowledge of God. That's why they had a famine in the first place, wasn't it? They weren't following God, they were following Baal all too often. And this famine had people gathering ideas, and they don't know how to distinguish the truth from the error. It may look good before you know the rest of the story, but when you know the rest of the story, this error is going to lead you into catastrophe. Verse 40, so they poured it out for the men to eat. And as they were eating of the stew, they cried out and said, "O man of God, there's death in the pot." And they were unable to eat. As they were eating, something as they were eating was already telling them. I don't think there were any symptoms yet. Nobody died. Doesn't tell us that anybody died at all here. But they sensed as they were eating. And it says they were unable to eat. Imagine their disappointment. There's famine in the land. They've got a pot of stew. They're all looking forward to this food. And they discover that they cannot eat the food. What's going to happen now? Usually stew had meat in it. When you make stew, you put meat in it, don't you? And that was true in that time too. We don't know if there was meat in this stew or not. They were glad to have it for a moment before they discovered that it was poisonous. A little poison made the whole thing harmful. That's something we have to be aware of in terms of the preaching of the Word of God. God has established His church in part to proclaim the truth, the whole counsel of God. And a little bit of error makes the whole thing dangerous. Verse 41, but he said, now bring meal. He threw it into the pot and said, pour it out for the people that they may eat. Then there was no harm in the pot. Would meal thrown into a pot that was poisonous just naturally clear things up? No, obviously not. This was an object lesson. This was something to say, look, we did something, but God was using it to show His action. If He just changed it, there would be nothing for them to see, but God wanted them to see something. God uses a visual aid rather frequently to accomplish what he wants to do. He doesn't need it. Meal in the pot's not essential, but God chose to use it, like Jesus chose to use a little bit of dirt and a little bit of saliva. He didn't need that to heal the sight. He chose to use that. And that's what it was here, little meal in the pot. And then in verse 42, a man brings food to the prophets. Now a man came from Baal Shalishah and brought the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. What a wonderful surprise. During a time of famine, no appointment, this guy just comes walking in and he's carrying all this food. That had to be a marvelous thing for them. Baal Shalishah, a town in the hill country of Ephraim, perhaps. 1 Samuel 9, verses 3 and 4. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. So Kish said to his son Saul, "Take now with you one of the servants and arise, go search for the donkeys." He passed through the hill country of Ephraim and passed through the land of Shalishah, but did not find them. Just a reference in passing. It's the only other reference to Shalishah that we have in the scriptures. So that may be the place in the hill country of Ephraim. On the other hand, you are aware that the same name commonly would be used in 2 or 3 different places. So it doesn't have to be this. Someone has described it from historical documents as being about 15 miles north of, I didn't write it down, Joppa. You remember Peter was sent to Joppa with the matter of Cornelius. About 15 miles north of there in the plain of Sharon. Along the Mediterranean Sea, between that and Mount Carmel and that string of mountains along there is the plain of Sharon. And there's a historical reference to a Baal Shalishah in that area there. I have a picture from that area. It was an illegitimate picture, and it was on Dawn's lap, and she had a great big rose of Sharon, and you're not supposed to pick those. So I have the evidence on her, and I can blackmail her anytime I want to. Yeah, so that was the plain of Sharon, and I remember that plain from that, and that could have been the area of Shalish. If so, this thing is a long ways from Gilgal, where apparently Elisha was in the area of the seminary for the sons of the prophets. So he came a ways across there. Somebody else says, no, this Shalishah was close to Gilgal. And if you look at a map, you know what you'll see. Absolutely nobody has attempted to put Baal Shalishah on a map. Oftentimes you will find on a map a name of a place and then a question mark. And maybe you'll find that in 2 different places or 3 different places. In this case, they didn't even put it in with a question mark, even though there are these suggestions of where it might have been. So this guy just showed up, and he was bringing the first fruits. The first fruits. Now the first fruits were at harvest time, the beginning of the year. You were supposed to take the first fruits. Do you know what you were supposed to do with the first fruits? You took them to the priest. You took them to the temple. And that's where they were given. But he had a problem because he was from north of the line that separated between Israel and Judah. And the king of Israel didn't want folks crossing over that line to go down to the temple. And if you're going to carry the first fruits with you, it's going to be pretty obvious if you're taking them down to the temple there. So that wasn't a good idea to take them down to the temple there. And that reference is Numbers 18:13. The first ripe fruits of all that is in their land, which they bring to the Lord, shall be yours, talking to the priests. Every one of your household who is clean may eat it. So this first fruits was being brought to the priests. But in 2 Chronicles 11:14, we find out what has happened to the priests in the north. For the Levites left their pasture lands and their property and came to Judah and Jerusalem. For Jeroboam and his sons had excluded them from serving as priests to the Lord. So these priests who lived north of the line moved south, as did a lot of the other people. So that even though the north went into captivity and never returned, there were people from all 12 tribes when the Judah returned from the Babylonian captivity, because there had been folks from all 12 tribes that had gone down there. Well, as it relates to our text, these priests going south meant that this fellow was going to have trouble giving his first fruits to the priests. There's two things you can do with that. Either you can say, well, God's prevented me from taking the first fruits of the priest, therefore I got them. That's one thing you could do with it. What's the other thing you could do with it?
Give it to the seminary.
You give it to the seminary students. You could take it to the prophet. And that's what he chose to do. We have to say this guy was pretty much on the ball, don't we? He did the best he could with the spirit of the law. He wasn't fulfilling the letter of the law by giving it to the priest, but under his circumstance, he wasn't able to do that, so he took it to Gilgal. The man faithfully sought his first fruits, the grain in his sack. The word occurs only here, and it's of uncertain meaning. You need to have some context for a word. You see a word and it's only in one place, and you say, okay, what does this thing mean here? Because well, there's some context, but it's not in the Bible. For example, this word was used to describe a planting between rows of trees. Let's say you had some olive trees, and they were in a row here, and they were in a row here. Well, you might plant a low crop in between the olive trees. And that row of crops in between the trees was described or labeled with this same word. And so you think, okay, how does that work out here? It's talking about grain in his sack. Grain in his sack. And the King James translation is corn in the husk thereof. How do you like that? Our translation is grain in his sack. Their translation is corn in the husk thereof. And you can see in the corn the idea of rows. If you've got rows of things, and this is used to rows, maybe that's the right explanation. This is one of those cases where God has not preserved for us an exact definition. He didn't send the dictionary with the Bible. Wouldn't that have been nice? But he didn't. And we have to say he gave us what we needed. So, whatever it was, this fellow brought the first fruits to Elisha. You knew what I needed. And in verse 42, somebody thinks this isn't enough. And he said, give them to the people that they may eat. His attendant said, what will I set before 100 men? What's the idea? You've invited too many people to dinner, or you didn't bring enough dinner. One of the two. It's like the farmer, and he had guests, and he didn't have enough chairs for everybody. And somebody said, "You don't have enough chairs." He says, "I got plenty of chairs. I got too much company." One way or the other, it wasn't going to go around. But he said, "Give them to the people that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left over." 20 loaves would be more like fat pancakes than our loaves. Their loaves tended to be some, what's the word I want? The stuff that before you bake it, dough. The dough, that's what it is. And their ovens you've seen are kind of like a beehive or something, kind of a cone shape. And they could reach in the top of that and slap this on the side. And it's good to have it sticky because it would stick to the side of the oven and it would bake that way. But it would be like a fat pancake. It wouldn't be the kind of loaf that you're thinking about when you go down to Safeway and get a loaf of bread. 20 loaves, in other words, wouldn't feed so many people as 20 of our loaves of bread would. So he gives it to the people. In time of famine, everybody was hungry. This guy showed up and gave this food to Elisha, and Elisha could have said to himself, "Self, there's not enough to go around to everybody, and this could take care of me and my family for several days. So I'm the prophet of God and I should get it." Could have said that, couldn't he? Aren't you glad he didn't? He looked at that and he looked at the people and he said, "You know, let's give this to the people." And somebody says, "That's not such a hot idea. Not going to go around." But he shared. That's a pretty decent thing. It is said concerning some of those who sent to the support of Paul that they gave according to their means and beyond their means. Sometimes they just gave what they could and beyond what they could really spare, and God honored that. And that shows love, and that's a beautiful thing. So God makes it sufficient, plus some left over. Verse 44, so he set it before them. Then they ate and had some left over according to the word of the Lord.
Amen.
They ate and had some left over. God supplies what his people need. My God shall supply all of your needs according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. Don't fret if you can't see how God's going to do it. This people could not see how God was going to make this enough. And I don't know how he did it. Did he multiply it? When God fed the 5,000, he multiplied it, obviously. He didn't make everybody kind of satisfied because there was more left over than what he started with. On this occasion, it may be that everybody got filled early, but I think he multiplied it. That's the way I take this passage. Jesus would do this on a grander scale. In both cases, there was a bit left over. Now, when I was growing up at home, the rule was eat everything on your plate. Do not leave a thing. And I did that, and I learned that I had to eat everything on my plate. And it resulted in me eating more than I ought to have eaten. I should have quit when I was full. It would have been better for me, and what I left on the plate was not going to feed any of the poor folks in Africa.
No, but you were told it, weren't you?
I was told, yes. You were told the same thing, I take it.
Yeah.
Sure. There are people starving. Finish it up.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. In another home of which I know, it was polite to leave a little bit on your plate. You never ate the last bite, because you were saying thereby, I had plenty had everything I needed, and there was some left over. And I think that's the message in what God does. He gives enough for everybody to be satisfied and a little bit left over. That's a pretty good message. God showing us that He can supply plenty for our needs. The primary false god with whom they were dealing, and the reason for the famine, was the god Baal. And he was supposed to be the god of fertility. He was supposed to make it possible for them to have everything they needed to eat. But he didn't work. And they didn't have enough, and there was famine. The reason there was famine was because they were worshiping him, Baal. But God, when He gave something to eat, He gave them plenty and a little bit left over. If they'd been faithful to God, there would not have been a famine. You read the promises of God when He's giving the law back in the Pentateuch, and you find out that He says that He's going to bless them if they worship Him. He's going to bless their food. He's going to bless their animals. He's going to bless their crops. He's going to bless them with peace. One of them will chase 1,000 and all that sort of thing, if they're faithful to God. They weren't faithful to God, and we know what happened, and it was exactly what He said was going to happen there in Deuteronomy. I suggest to you that America suffers defeats because we've left off serving God. I know, I say this every once in a while, but it sure fits here, doesn't it? We have freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is exactly right. It's a good thing. It's a question of how do we use it. If we use our freedom of religion to follow some false god, our freedom of religion does not guarantee that we'll have success and prosperity, does it? Success and prosperity depend upon our worshiping God, no matter how much freedom to worship all kinds of gods that we have. And if we're worshiping the wrong gods, God's not going to bless us. And sitting around saying, well, I've got freedom of religion. I can do what I want to do. Yeah, you do that. See how it works out for you. And it's not going to work out well. Despite our having the very strongest military might in the world, we have suffered a striking series of defeats. We battled to a stalemate in Korea. And there is in that land to this very day an armistice line. It's still an active battle line, except they're just not shooting over it except every once in a while. We never did get to a victory in Korea. Matter of fact, some of you who were alive at the time may remember we never called it a war. It wasn't a war. We were just shooting at them and dropping bombs on them, and people were being killed, but it wasn't a war.
Neat term, police action.
Police action, yeah. It's all in the political spin, isn't it? And we lost the police action. Well, you know, it came to a stalemate. It shouldn't have come to a stalemate. Now we're baffled by North Korea. We don't seem to know what to do with them. God's let them be quite a thorn in our flesh, hasn't He? And in the Vietnam era, a third world power effectively drove us out. Oh, I know. Peace with honor. We're good at euphemisms. We're not very good at victories these days. On 9/11, we found out that it didn't even take a whole nation to give us a black eye. God could allow just a few terrorists to get it done. Boy, that was a dark day, wasn't it? In Afghanistan, we won battles, but we still suffer entanglement and discouragement in that land. And we still have armies there advising the Afghanis. Yeah, In Iraq, We won the major victories, the major battles, but where are we now? I think we're claiming now that ISIS has been driven out of Mosul, and I'm telling you, for the might that we have, our performance is woefully lacking. Do you know why it's woefully lacking? It isn't because our military is inadequate. We have plenty of military. It's because we have forsaken God. We have the military muscle, but we don't have the blessing of God. We reject God's instruction for the death penalty. He says that when somebody murders someone else, the blood pollutes the land. And the only way that pollution can be atoned for, do you know what it is? By the shedding of the blood of the person who did it. He doesn't say it requires special circumstances. If he did it and you can prove it beyond any doubt, then you need to, as a state action, you need to put him to death. We're not doing that. We're not honoring God. We reject God's design for the sanctity of life. You know what I'm talking about? We reject God's design for marriage. No one ever came up with the modern ideas of marriage by reading in God's Word. And God didn't leave the subject alone. It's not a vacuum, it's pretty clear. I was telling somebody just this morning, I used to say, no, it wasn't this morning, it was this afternoon over at Sherwood Oaks. I used to say a pastor needs to be a man because he is to be the husband of one wife. And now our society is changing the terminology so that a woman can be the husband of one wife in our modern technology. Isn't that a clever way to work your way around it? Doesn't really do it, though, does it?
No.
What are we doing? We're thumbing our nose at God. We're saying we know better than that. We're saying we got rights. We reject God's design for gender. I read it just today in a news item. In London, at the parks and different places, they would open up the presentation with, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen." That's all over. They can't say that anymore because some folks felt left out. Can't say ladies and gentlemen because you're not properly dealing with the people who don't think they're either one. Really weird, God-rejecting ideas. We're going to the extremes. We're just, do you understand the idea of thumbing your nose? We're thumbing our noses at God. We invent rights for perversion while we take away rights of worship and faith. Then we wonder, why do we have problems? Of course, a lot of the thinking is there is no God. We don't have to worry about that. But there is a God. And this God does sometimes send famine, and sometimes he sends defeat. He mercifully tries to get our attention. He's got the word out there. He's got preachers preaching it. But people aren't paying attention. God still wants to give us enough and a little bit extra. And that's what he did. One time he did it by getting rid of the poison in the pot. Another time he did it by sending along a fella with not enough to go around, and he multiplied it and made it enough to go around. But God delights to supply for people who love him and serve him. And I suggest to you that we can still love him and serve him and be blessed by him no matter what other people around us are doing. Might it be hard? It might be very hard. You might pay a price for honoring God. But it can only be for the first 100 years. Give or take a few. It can't be beyond that. God is going to richly bless His own people. He loves for people to demonstrate their faithfulness to Him, and the worse the world gets, the more impressive our faithfulness to God is. We have great opportunity. Let's not compromise. Let's stand true to God and expect His blessing long term.